Welcome back to One More Mana. My name is Derik, and today we are finally getting into another deck tech. It has been a long while since Ken and I have been doing a lot more videos together, trying to combine our petty powers into one ultimate petty being, but for today, kind of splitting off to get into some Phyrexian deck techs, because it has been too long, and especially that since we are like in the age of Phyrexia, just overdue to talk about some of the decks I've been building. Today, there's a deck tech from Phyrexia All Be One. We have a deck doctor for a patron coming out very soon, and a couple other decks that I've recently built with some old Phyrexians from the past that are just have been re-inspired to go ahead and build. So very excited to get into those. But for today, we'll be focusing on Ovika, Enigma, Goliath. Ovika seems absolutely terrifying and beautiful and all the things I love. So I'm very excited to get into this. But before we do, if you want to help support the channel and help us get out more and more Phyrexian content, then head over to Into the AM. Into the AM is amazing, super comfortable, and looks amazing, but I know you don't want to take advice on looking good from me. You want an expert in the matter, and that's why we have Kenneth the Heathen. Kenneth, tell them why they should rock the Into the AM. Hello there, my name is Kenneth the Heathen, and I am here to tell you that beautiful man such as myself with this luscious beard, you can't see it, but it goes all the way down to the floor and over into the other room in my apartment. I have to brush it for 7 hours a day. You may not be able to look as good as I do, but you can get close by rocking Into the AM. It is comfy, it is beautiful, and it is my second favorite thing, right behind not eating at Subway. Subway, if I ever find you... Ken, we're gonna cut you off right there. I don't think Subway's a person, but we'll let that pass. Listen to the expert in Kenneth about the Into the AM stuff, not his vendetta against Subway, and rock Into the AM. Remember what he always says, something about screaming and dripping in space. If you use the affiliate link down below, you can get a discount and you can help support the channel at the same time. We always appreciate all the love. Now let's move on to Ovika. Ovika is absolutely terrifying. It is 5, a blue and a red for a 6/6 flyer with ward, pay 3 life, and 3 mana. It's a lot going on there. It's a 7 mana value commander, which typically right away makes me ignore it, which kind of makes me sad. It just feels like it's so hard to get there, but the payoff for this is more than worth it, because every time you cast a non-creature spell, you get X 1/1 Phyrexian goblins equal to that spell's mana value, and then they gain haste until end of turn. This gives me very strong Buggy Man vibes with the whole 1/1 creatures with haste. Obviously, these aren't flyers, but that mana value thing is crazy. This is a very, very powerful commander, and I love how broad it is. I compare it a lot to the Locust God in playstyle, but it gives you so many more options. With the Locust God, I love that deck, but it is very much you have to go all in on card draw. Card draw is your payoff, so you're going to end up with wheels or explosive draw, and that's really how you're going to win. With this, you can go in a million different directions. You can go with Is It Spellslinger, which is already a very strong archetype, and just try to like storm off basically, and you have that 1/1 token payoff in the command zone to go wide while you storm off and gives you another axis to win on. You can go Is It Artifacts, and Is It Artifacts is a super well established build, and just go all in on artifacts, and every time you cast an artifact, if it's not a creature, you're getting goblins as well, and you can find synergies within that to go ahead and build on that, and again, give Is It Artifacts another axis to win on. That's the coolest thing about this, is it's taking these established builds that already have win cons and giving you a completely almost random direction thrown in to also further your game plan. You can even go Enchantress, which is not a necessarily like very well established thing, and Is It, but if you want to get weird, getting weird is always fun. You can just go all in on Enchantress and turn this into an awesome goblin build with all of the cool goblin enchantments, and it's really cool what you can do with it. And Is It, you're not going to see any more Is It enchantment decks out there, so it's really unique, and that's also super fun. Or you can honestly just make a goblin build, throw your favorite goblins in, and put more focus onto the Krenko's commands and the mana echoes and all the cool enchantments and sorceries that synergize in goblin decks. And now bam, you have a commander for that. It is so flexible. What I decided to do for my build is one of the things that made me most excited. My first thought, again, it's a 7 mana value commander. So my first thought is we need a lot of ramp. The coolest thing about this commander, what really scares me away from high mana value commanders that are threats like this, is the amount of ramp you need to consistently get your commander out before the game's being decided is insane. And so many times with that, you end up drawing into ramp spells late game that are just useless. If you ramp, you get your commander out, you're all excited to do the thing. Use the Locust God for an example, and then you draw 3 mana rocks in a row. Those are dead draws, and it really felt bad, and I can never really find my happy medium to where I felt like I was ramping enough, but I never felt like it was just a dead draw late. This gets rid of that. Those late game mana rocks are goblins, and that is something that kind of really spoke to me. I was very much debating, like, what if I just go all mana rocks, just like mana rock deck, and just did it. And I'm not too far away from that. The whole focus of this deck for me is just put in a, again, scientific measurement, a metric shit ton of mana rocks. I think there's like 24 of them in the deck. Put in even more ramp in other spaces, go as a bare minimum on creatures, and essentially ramp, get your commander out early, and then use some cool explosive effects mixed in to have awesome explosive goblin plays. And like I said, the best thing is, if you draw those mana rocks, we have enough card advantage to, one, it shouldn't matter, and two, it's still making goblins and just setting it up so if your commander does manage to get killed and your opponents get past the ward, you can continue to recast it. There's some cool little Spellslinger synergies, there's some cool little goblin synergies, but that main focus is on making sure you have ramp and explosive plays, which is, for me, is honestly a very played out archetype in like green decks, because there's so many that do that. But to have that type of build and seems really exciting to me, and I'm super excited to really see how this deck plays out in the long term and how it evolves over time. So we're going to jump into the categories and start with the creatures, because it is that bare minimum. I only have 5 creatures in the entire deck. Honestly, it should be 4, but one of them is a pet card, so I wanted it to be in there. And these creatures represent different phases of the game. I put Bergie in not as a storm card, but as a setup card. Bergie is obviously a broken card, but the way I want to use it in here is get Bergie out early, and it'll allow you to more easily chain mana rock into mana rock. So if you get Bergie out on turn with ramp, maybe turn 2 or 3, then you can go ahead and more easily go like Signet into Signet, or Commander Sphere into Signet, or whatever you're trying to do. It'll let you have more plays where you don't have leftover mana and just get your rocks out faster to potentially get you to a commander a turn early, 2 turns early, which for a 7 mana value commander is huge. And obviously that 1 extra mana that pops up is kind of just crucial. It might be too big of a threat, and if Bergie ends up coming out and just immediately dying, oh well, 3 mana just ate up removal that won't be used on your commander. So I kind of love what it does in here. Then you also want stuff while your commander's out, while you're going off, and that's stuff like Perforos and stuff like Devilish Valet, which huge payoff once you have your commander out. So when you're doing the thing making the goblins, these are massive payoff cards that even though they're not on non-creatures, you still love them there. But this last category I think might be the most important, and I may need more in this slot, and that is you want payoff for once you've gotten goblins, maybe you don't have enough to win and your commander dies. Especially late game, let's say you've got like 10 goblins out. 10 1/1s is a lot, but it's not game ending. Someone just spot removes your commander, you're in a really awkward spot. So stuff like Krenko and Chancellor of the Forge are amazing, because your commander doesn't have to be out. As long as you have some goblins, which most times you should, Krenko's obviously just going to give you exponential goblins. You don't need to hear about Krenko. And Chancellor of the Forge is just basically going to double the number of goblins you have, and that works so well with your other synergies. So these are basically just goblin pooping outlets that are just going to poop out a bunch of goblins even without your commander in play. I just feel like the creatures so well represent all the phases of your game plan, and it's just bare bones, but they're all super crucial. Now we're going to get into the instants and sorceries. I'll go sorceries first, then instants. But these as a whole really are just there for explosive ramp effects, cool card draw effects, and then mixing in some spot removal. We can never ramp enough in this deck, essentially, and we want to make sure we have enough either X spells or big mana value spells to take advantage of that and make it work. When we look at the sorceries, we have a lot of our card draw in here, and then a lot of our crazy ramp. So if you look at card draw, we got stuff like Distant Melody, so just drawing off of all their goblins. Or one of my favorites is Imposing Grandeur. Imposing Grandeur it's a really interesting card in that it's a wheel, and this deck does not want wheels. Just hot take. You do not want a wheel in this deck because you don't want to draw your opponents into removal. Your commander is going to be removal magnet number 1 at the table sometimes, most times, a lot of times. So don't wheel. That's bad. It's just going to give your opponent's card advantage, and you want it. So if they do use removal, you want them to run out. You don't want them to refill. This card takes an interesting take on that, though, because it punishes the low mana value, really efficient commanders. So all of you guys at the table playing like, yeah, all y'all at the table, if you're playing like a Lorthos, or if you're playing a Drakuseth, or all these, just all of Kyle's commanders, if you're playing these like 7, 8 mana value commanders, they're going to benefit. But everyone who's out there playing like Reese or Timna or all these other things that are like hyper efficient, low to the ground, they might not want to wheel because they're going to be giving up cards to get less cards. So it's more of a fun card, kind of a pet card. I've just really wanted to find a deck that worked for it, because most of my red decks have lower mana value commanders. but I do think it may work without the huge risk involved with most wheels, but that's something I'm going to have to kind of test over time. And then the huge ramp effects, obviously you have something like a Jessica's Will and a Mana Geyser. These are just amazing ramp effects in red to get you way ahead early, or to really account for any amount of commander attacks that could be out there, or to fuel the X spells. You have just so many options, but I think my favorite one is Rousing Refrain. I love that you can play this on turn 2, and then the Suspend 3 isn't that bad. What it basically makes sure that every 3 turns, you're going to have a little bump in mana to either recast your commander or throw into an X spell. And I love that. Most games I feel like it's too slow, but for a deck like this, where your commander's going to be getting killed regularly, just knowing that light at the end of the tunnel, knowing you're going to have that little burst of mana to get your commander back out is amazing, and I really just love what it's doing there. Now, in the instance, we have our removal here, and we also have a lot of the same things, big spells, X effects, draw effects, but I want to focus on the removal and using removal that helps our game plan. So stuff like Mind Swipe. I'm almost running no counter spells in this deck. I have so many decks with blue that focus on protecting your commander and countering. I did a weird strategy in this, but because we're running so much ramp, my focus is not to counter everybody's removal and counter everyone's spells, it's to ramp through it. It's to say, whatever, I'm gonna ramp so many times that if you want to waste all your removal on my commander, I'm gonna just keep recasting it until you get tired of it. Now, I don't know if that's a good game plan, but it's what I'm going for. But I am running a counter spell like Mind Swipe. You can just dump mana into it, get a bunch of goblins, and throw damage around. It's furthering our game plan, and it's a huge payoff towards the end of the game. I love Electro Dominance. It's removal, but it's also an X spell, just mana sink, and it helps us cast extra spells to get extra goblins at instant speed. And this is an X spell, but Divergent Transformations can be a polymorph effect to get one of our very important creatures, but it's also something you can cast for cheaper than the mana value to get a bunch of goblins. All of these do a tremendous job of furthering our game plan, and it's one thing I love about this deck. It's a little weird, so you get to use some of these cards that are decent in other decks, but honestly just so much better than other removal here, because yeah, you can have like a rapid hybridization and this and that as spot removal, but having the flexibility to be able to pay 10 mana for your removal in this deck is actually great, because that's how you can get all of those goblins. Now we're going to move over to the artifacts, and for the rest of the instant sorceries, definitely check out the deck list. There are more targets, there are more kind of cool kind of pet cards I wanted to throw in, but you have a lot of flexibility. I would just say as long as it fits into the categories of, you know, ramp, card advantage, and removal, that's what those instants and sorceries are going to be. And if it's stuff that you either pay cheaper than its cost for, or that has X in it, that's what you can focus on. But definitely check out the deck list to see what direction I went. But we're going to move on to the artifacts. Artifacts are probably the most crucial portion. As I've mentioned, currently at the current deck list at the time of recording, there are 22 mana rocks. I think there's 27 ramp sources in the deck, but 22 cards that are just straight up mana rocks. And it honestly might go higher. It feels great because every game, it's very easy to, with a single mulligan, make sure that you have a hand with at least 1 or 2 mana rocks in it. And the best thing is it doesn't matter which ones you run. You don't need Mana Vault, you don't need Jeweled Lotus, you don't need Moxes and stuff. Because your commander's 7 mana value, any sort of ramp is basically going to get you to commander earlier. You can run all the signets you have, all the 3 mana ramp, all the Gilded Lotus, the Thran Dynamos of the world. They're all great in this deck because you're ramping and ramping and ramping. And even if you overramp, you really can't do that because if your commander gets killed, it can come right back. The one thing that I do see that I love in this deck is the ability to fully take advantage of some of the cool 3 CMC rocks that have been printed over the last few years. You got stuff like Skyclave Relic that you can just use an indestructible rock or get a bunch. My pet card Midnight Clock that I cannot stop putting into decks. You have Heraldic Banner, Glittering Stockpile, so many cool rocks. A game ender like Strixhaven Stadium. All of those amazing rocks. Because honestly, in this deck, the difference between a 2 and a 3 rock doesn't matter too much as long as you have a good chunk of 2 mana rocks to get it started. We're ramping so much it doesn't matter, but it really is just find a pile of them. They don't have to be expensive cards. They don't have to be super efficient. It's whatever mana ramp you can find and just shove it in. Because yeah, we're not trying to build this deck to be explode competitive when on turn 3. We just want to make sure turn 7 isn't when we get our commander out. That's the biggest thing. So you can look at the rocks I chose. If you got all the fancy ones, go with that. And if you're just trying to play like Firemind Vessel and Sisay's Ring and stuff like that, you're gonna have just as good of a time. Might be a turn slower, but it still kind of gets what you need to get done. Really the only non-mana rocks or non-ramp cards in this category are Skull Clamp, which is just an obvious include, I guess, and Ember Cleave, which I love because our commander can all of a sudden be a 2-turn kill with that, and that is spicy, and yeah, I love that. Now let's move on to the enchantments. The enchantments are kind of broken down into two categories. We have the Goblin package with Goblin Bombardment, Impact Tremors, Shared Animosity, and Mana Echoes. These are, I basically just took these from Krenko and put them in there. They are amazing in this deck. They are deadly in this deck, and they can just basically end the game. It's ridiculous. But what I love is what blue has brought to the table that obviously you can't just play in a Goblin deck. Shark Typhoon is basically, you can go heavier into backup commanders in this deck, running stuff like Talrand and all those, but I really just focused on Shark Typhoon. That's really our backup commander. If all doesn't work, this can be a second copy to make big sharks and swing, which is a great sentence to say. Now, Overburden is a card I put in here that might be too mean. I would suggest you can cut it for like a, I don't know, like a Mystic Remorse or a Search for Azcanta or other some sort of card advantage I would recommend. It's a very mean card. It basically says whenever a non-token creature enters, that player has to bounce a land back to hand. It's not even cast, so cheating creatures into play, mass reanimation. If a non-token creature is entering, you're bouncing a land. It barely affects you at all because you have 6 total creatures counting your commander. But again, it might be way too mean. So swap that out. And Mana Echoes is similar. If you get Mana Echoes out and cast a spell, it's very easy to chain into a sequence where you just have effectively infinite colorless mana. If that's too explosive and too mean for your playgroup, honestly, I suggest going with something like a Mind's Dilation, which is a big, terrifying, explosive card, but it doesn't have that just like, oh gosh, is it going infinite feeling of a Mana Echo. So those are kind of good swaps if you want to stay in a more contained, because this deck isn't meant to be competitive, so if you feel like it's leaking into that, those are good ones to cut. Moving on to the lands, this could be one of the most simple mana bases you ever build. You can straight up just go all basics. More than almost any deck, literally if you played all mountains in the deck, because we have so many mana rocks that don't require a specific color and color fix us, the colors our lands tap for matter less than most decks. The most important thing is just that our lands come into play untapped, and basics are the best way to do that. I know I said with the mana rocks, you don't have to get expansive, you don't have to get expensive, and really what can counterbalance that is just to make sure that you have all your lands coming to play untapped. If you're trying to get too fancy with your mana base with a bunch of stuff untapped, you're going to miss those 3 CMC rocks on curve, or you're going to draw a land when you need to recast your commander and not be able to do it. So I would recommend, one, have a lot of lands. Don't shortchange your lands. You don't want to miss land drops in this deck. I think with MDFCs, I'm at 38. You want to be around there and make sure that almost all of these are coming into play untapped, and the cheapest way to do that is with basics. Maybe throw in a Myriad Landscape, and honestly, you're good to go. If you went half islands, half mountains, you would probably have a great time every time you try to play. And that is going to do it for all the categories. Let's move on to the best part of every deck tech, in this case, the gobliniest, the most gobbo. And that is the game-winning step. We're about to win the game with this deck, and there are some great ways to do it, and we're going to break it down into a few categories. The first category that I'm going to talk about is basically goblins entering, giving you payoff. So we want to just benefit off of the fact that we're getting goblins into the battlefield, and a lot of them. So that's stuff like Impact Tremors, Perforos. You can even count Mana Echoes in there because you're just going to generate a bunch of mana, and you can Electro Dominance or Fireball something. Those are kind of the classic Goblin win con, and they are so powerful. And I think my favorite version of this is Devilish Valet. This is one of my favorite cards I've ever seen. I remember when it was printed, I was so excited about it, but I had no decks to put it in. I didn't even know where it could potentially go. And this is just the perfect deck for it. It's so easy to just basically make this thing like 300 power, and it's got Trample and Haste built in. That's the silly part, is it's 3 mana in your hand. Basically, you can hold it. If you end up with like 10 mana on like turn 7, which you can do, play in your commander's out, you play this, play like a 6 or 7 mana value spell, that's a one-shot kill to somebody. This card is silly. One of the most fun things to do is just see how ridiculously big you can make it. It's a really fun card, and I think of all, everybody's been killed by a Perforos, everybody's been killed by an Impact Tremors. It happens all the time. I think Devilish Valet is a more fun version of that because of the comically large numbers that you can come up with. Now, the second way is going to be attacking with your goblins, and that's with payoff with stuff like Shared Animosity, which will get very silly. Or probably my favorite is Surge to Victory. I talked about this in a Krenko rebuild I did, and I've talked about it, I believe, in the Locust God. This card is incredibly silly in that it takes the instant sorcery out of your graveyard, buffs all your creatures by it, and they'll let you keep recasting it. This is very much a game-winning card in that you're probably going to kill a player just from swinging. And then in addition, casting all the copies of the card is just going to make you an insane number of goblins to where it's going to be counter or board wipe, or you just win. And it is so explosive, and a card that honestly in this deck, it's like the power level of a Crater Hoof, but I don't think I've ever seen the card cast. So it is a more exciting kind of different take on that explosive overrun effect. And this deck really makes me realize this deck is doing so many things that a green deck would do, but off color and in weird ways. And honestly, if this deck was green doing these things, I'd be all like super bored by it, not even want to play it. But because we're trying to do it, it makes a lot of decisions just way more interesting to me. Now the last, there's one more way with combat. I gotta slow down because Strixhaven Stadium, whew, this is a perfect deck for this as well. It is busted in the Locust God. You can kind of go off and kill somebody, but even more so in this deck, it is so easy in the playtesting I've done to end up with 20 and 30 goblins in a single turn and just go off in Strixhaven Stadium. It is spicy. And with those three, I think would kind of represent that. You can just swing in with your goblins for the win. And the last way to win the game, this deck is so focused on dealing damage, whether through combat or like Perforos types effects, that if someone's just gaining an arbitrary amount of life, you want to have like a backup win con. That's going to be represented through Embercleave. Can't forget that your commander is a 6/6 flyer with protection, so Embercleave in on that is going to be 14 commander damage right away, and you can put someone on a 2-turn clock, even if they have ways to deal with your mass token army. And I think in a deck that is so all in on that, really kind of benefit from having, it's almost like a weird version of the Devilish Valet where it's just one creature swinging in big, but that commander damage rule really helps if there's any sort of infinite life shenanigans going on. That's going to do it for this week's deck tech. I really hope y'all enjoyed it. This seems like an incredibly fun deck. I'm going to be playtesting it. I'll be actively updating this deck list. So if anything seems different from what I mentioned, I'll be making edits, trying to keep it up to date with my live deck, because this is a deck that I have built in paper that I'm actively playing. So if you see anything that I mentioned that's not there, I'll try to put notes or something, but I will have this updated real time. This, I think, is my favorite all will be one commander, and by a wide margin so far. So I guess in the main set, the XL is very close if you count the commander products too, but these are two of my favorite decks I've been playing in a while. What are y'all favorite all will be one commander decks? These legendaries seem so much fun so far, and I've been having a blast. Got my hand on some of the oily foils and all that. It just makes me so happy. So yes, what are your favorite all will be one cards that you've had a chance to play with? Because at this point the set's been out for a little while and we finally kind of get to get a feel for how everything's playing. As always, a huge shout out to the patrons. We love and appreciate y'all so much. We have so much to come. Like I mentioned, got some patron related videos coming up soon, more deck techs, and obviously the regular shenanigans of all of us just screaming at each other in the best ways possible. So until then, I'll see y'all next time.